staff are trying to get connected. But we have a great presenter here tonight, and a lot to cover with him, because this is one big opportunity. And so I want to be able to get right to it. Tonight is really something that I'm always frustrated we don't have time for. Lots and lots of planning and development happens in Don Valley North. This has been a busy ward really since the turnstiles opened for the Shepherd subway. Most of the people, I saw the list of some of the signups, and I know most of you have lived that. And so planning and development is always happening, but we often don't have the time we really should take at the beginning of community meetings to really talk about the process itself. How does planning and development work? Certainly a year ago, when Bill 108 was proposed by the province to change it radically, and we had a big meeting at that time, we found that a lot of people had some fundamental questions about the existing process, let alone the changes that have happened. And right from that point on, early in 2019, we thought we really should have a foundational, what is planning and development? And what is that process in terms of what the city can do and what the province controls? And so what we've asked is that our North York senior planner, someone you see because he often accompanies his community planner staff at our meetings, John Andrzejewski, is here. And what we're going to ask John to do is answer some of our questions about this process, demystify it for us. Afterwards, I'm going to ask him some questions first that are sort of questions we hear very, very often from residents. But afterwards, we're going to take your questions. But there is one rule tonight. What we would like is for people, if they have questions, we want them to type them. If you look at the bottom right-hand corner of your screen, you'll see a little bubble that says participants, and then in blue letters, Q&A. And so if you want to have a question asked of John at the end of the presentation part, type your question in there. Our staff will be looking at those and putting them in order for me. And sometimes where the exact same question is answered, they'll put them together so that as many of the information points get out as possible tonight. We're having to make the rule that we're not going to drill down into individual applications. I know that's going to be frustrating for some, because if there's one right in your neighborhood, there's a concern right now. But tonight, we really want to give you the overview of how planning and development works, right to the point of approval. And so then when you call in to my office, or when you're looking at the sign and you see the phone number of a planner, when you're phoning in about that individual application after this meeting, you'll know so much more when you open into that conversation. And so tonight, it's about the process. The question should be, clarify this for me. Some of you will have experienced something as a result of an individual development process. Well, this happened. We had this type of meeting where the applicant was hosting. Why didn't you hold it as a planner? You may have experienced that as a result of one application and want to know why it worked that way. That's still a valid question, because that's sort of a universal question. So while you may be thinking about something that happened right nearby in your neighborhood, try and ask the questions in such a way that is really learning for everyone, no matter where they live in Don Valley North, because we really are growing across the whole map, as you'll see later on. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce you to John. If you can see John's tile on your screen, wave there, John. Good evening, John. Some of you who visited North York Community Council for Development will have seen him sitting in that row of very serious people, the staff members sitting along the side. But that was in the old days when we used to meet in person. So tonight he's coming to you virtually. John, we've given you a little idea of the questions we're going to ask. So you have a presentation that's going to roll across the screen while you're answering my questions, I understand.
Yes, I do, Councilor.
Yeah. So if you want to share that with us now, if it cooperates.
Cooperates.
There you go. So there we are at the title page, and that's really what this is about: planning and development. It's that simple. And so we're gonna walk through your presentation, and I guess what we will do is start with the most fundamental question of all: what happens when a developer wants to build something? Let's just start right there.
So thank you for the invitation, Councillor. You made a comment that we're serious. We're not always that serious. This is actually my first virtual meeting trying this out. So staff have done a number of these, but this is my first virtual meeting. So bear with me if there's any technical glitches. But yes, I am the manager for community planning, one of three managers for community planning in North York, and I deal with wards 15, 16, and 17. So in terms of what happens when a developer wants to build, the first thing planners always begin with is the zoning. And I have put some very high-tech slides, obviously, together here. But basically, every property in the city has a zoning that's associated with it. And zoning bylaws will specify the use of a property, what you can build. For example, it'll tell you can build residential, commercial, industrial. And then it also tells you what standards you have to build to. And some of those standards are shown on the slide here. It'll say, for example, single-family detached, with a height of 9 meters, with a side yard, rear yard, front yard setback of X meters. And there are other standards like minimum green space, density, lot size, and there's always a parking requirement. And then obviously, again, the use as well. So every property in the city has that. And basically, if you comply with the zoning bylaw, you would come into the buildings department, you would get your building permit. There's all sorts of other requirements you have to meet through the building department, meeting the building code. But you would go straight to building, get your permit, and away you go, essentially. Planning would never see the application. It gets to planning when you don't comply with one of these elements. So there are kind of two routes you can take. You can take the minor variance route. And I think most people probably have experience with the minor variance process. It's when you're building, but you can't quite meet the standard. And what we're seeing a lot is people want to go higher. People want to go a bit wider. So you'll get a variance on, if the bylaw says a maximum 10 meters in height, and someone wants to come in for 10.5, you come in through the minor variance process. There's also the rezoning process, and that's when you're making more substantial changes to the zoning bylaw, where it might be the use, the setbacks, the height, and it's something more substantial. For example, if you have a single family neighborhood and someone wants to come in and build townhouses or a mid-rise type of development, that's when we'd go through the rezoning process. And both processes, actually, the minor variance and the rezoning process, are public processes where the public is notified and there's consultation as part of that. So I wanted to, as part of this, is walk you through kind of a bit of a flow chart in terms of what we do when an application comes in for rezoning. And there is a pre-application process, which is not shown on here, but a lot of times developers will come to the city and schedule a pre-application meeting where they show us concepts and ideas. And we provide them with some general feedback. And we also let them know that we're going to need certain information for us to be able to assess that proposal. So we will give them a checklist, and that checklist will indicate what studies, plans, drawings we need to be able to accurately assess the proposal. So when the application's actually submitted, I get a lot of calls about where can I find the information. Anytime we get an application, all that information is posted on the city's website. And I have a link to it later on in the presentation, but all the studies, all the plans, all the drawings, they're all posted online and it's all available publicly. At the same time, what we do is we circulate those plans and studies to various departments. So typically what you'll see is we will circulate to engineering and construction services. There'll be stormwater management plan, there'll be servicing plans, it'll go to parks, forestry and recreation, arborist reports. It will also go to urban design, heritage planning if necessary, Toronto Transit Commission, school boards. So there's quite an array of people we would circulate this information to. And that's the same information that's available on the website. What's next in this process?
And if I can say, John, that part takes a long time, doesn't it? Sometimes people see in the North York Mirror, they see, we're going to do this. A developer will put a big news story in, but the circulation to all the departments has to come back before you could say anything about what people read about in the paper. Am I right about that?
Yeah, we have made no decision at that point,
Yeah,
Councillor, and a lot of times developers, I mean, these applications are probably years in the works before they even come to planning. They're doing
right.
their due diligence behind the scenes, and we as a standard at the pre-application stage, we always tell the applicant to consult with the local councillor also to get sort of their feedback on the proposal as well. Some applicants do, some applicants don't.
Right.
So the next kind of phase in this is we prepare a preliminary report. And again, that preliminary report does not make a decision on the application. What it is it explains the proposal in detail, and then it highlights what we think are issues to date. So as part of that, we are also starting to get feedback from our departments and our agencies on that circulation. We get comments back from forestry, from engineering, and those comments are provided to the applicant. Those are comments the applicant has to address. But what we're also doing at that point is we're having our community meeting that's hosted by city planning. So we do a community consultation meeting with the community to get their feedback on the proposal. And most planners know their communities pretty well, but no one knows the community better than the residents they live in, the residents that live in it. So we would always go out and get that feedback from residents as to what they think about it. Because a lot of times you hear things about what's coming in. We do post a sign on site, but there's limited information on that sign. So it's an opportunity for the developer to actually present the proposal. And at those meetings, the local councillor is there, planning staff is there, the developer is there, and residents are there. And residents can ask questions at that community meeting, and they could provide feedback. So after that stage, developers will have comments from residents, they'll have comments from the technical circulation, they'll have comments from the preliminary report that's flagged some issues. At that point, we provide all that information back to the developer, and they kind of go away and revise. In an ideal world, they revise their proposal to address everything. That doesn't always happen. So in that kind of box here that says applicant makes revisions to application, sometimes there's multiple revisions that are made. It's not always on the first try. So sometimes there's a lot of back and forth on that. So when we get to a point where the technical comments have been addressed, city planning will prepare a final report, and that goes to North York Community Council initially, and that report has recommendations. And that report has recommendations to either support, refuse, modify. So there's a number of things that could happen there. And residents also have an opportunity again to voice their concerns about the proposal at community council. Those recommendations ultimately go to city council for a decision. And I think at that point there's a number of things that could happen. If there's no objection, then there's usually bills associated with that. That's the changes to the bylaw. The amending bylaw is attached, and that bill would get adopted, and then the developer can build. A lot of times what we're finding these days, there's appeals. That's that little purple box, potential for appeals to LPAT, where if the developer doesn't like the decision of council, they can appeal it. If the residents don't like the decision of council, they could appeal it. So there is an opportunity to appeal that decision. So that kind of, in a nutshell, is what the process is, and it's a very simplified process that I'm giving you. There's also other opportunities for consultation that we'll talk a bit later, but the two kind of main, events are the community consultation meeting where we go out to the public, and then the report from city planning at community council. Those are kind of the two key events where residents can voice their concerns and their opinions to the local councillor and planning staff, and then again to all of North York Community Council and planning staff as well. So maybe I'll just.
So I think you're on the 2 slides forward. So if you could backtrack a little bit, because we're on
we skipped one. We're just one slide ahead. Yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So, John, that the issue of city council making a decision, if they don't like our decision, they can appeal to LPAT. But this might be a good spot to explain. Some of the people on the call have been, involved in this locally since it was the OMB, the Ontario Municipal Board, and now it has this new name, the Local Planning Appeal Tribunal, but it's still a provincial body, isn't it? Yeah.
It's still a provincial body. It still functions the same way. There were a number of bills. There was Bill 139 that for a time under the Liberals changed how the appeal tribunal functioned, and then there was Bill 108 that kind of changed things back. So it's essentially a body that takes it out of council's hands and makes a decision on the application.
Yeah. Okay. And so, right, and so which has happened a lot lately. It's almost always the case in a large site. So then the next slide, which we went to prematurely, really gets at the question we always get from community when they're not happy, because we've had rapid growth and people aren't always happy, and so they ask sometimes when we get the report and the report says go ahead with this, why did they say yes to the rezoning? What were they looking at? What is it you have to look at to give your recommendations in the report?
So let me see if the tech works right. So you see
There
the
it
layers.
is, yeah.
Okay, so I always like to think of this as kind of that reverse pyramid, right? Where you go from the general down to the more specific. So the first thing is there's the Planning Act in Ontario, and that kind of sets the ground rules for land use planning in Ontario and describes how land can be controlled and who can control it. And the act is legislation passed by the province, and I always look at the Planning Act as a rule book. It tells you can rezone, you can do an official plan, and these are the rules when you go through that process.
Mm-hmm.
And at the provincial level as well, there's the provincial policy, which provides policy direction on matters of provincial interest related to land use planning and development, and it sets the policy foundation for regulating the development of land in Ontario. And it provides directions on matters related to land use, employment, housing, infrastructure, resources, health, and safety. But they're broad policies that apply province-wide. And then there's the growth plan as well, which the growth plan is for the Greater Golden Horseshoe. Obviously, Toronto is a key component in that, and that provides sort of a bit more guidance in terms of a framework for managing growth and protection in the Greater Golden Horseshoe. And so it builds on the PPS, and I always look at the growth plan. And the one thing the growth plan did is it talked about MTSAs. So those are major transit station areas, and it talked about establishing minimum densities around those, and that's relevant to Ward 17 because we have the Shepherd Corridor. But the key piece, I think, in all this is the city's official plan. And the official plan kind of takes the growth plan, takes the PPS, and it kind of implements it. It always talks about the official plan being the most important tool to implement those policies. And the official plan is a legal document approved by council, and it describes the policies and objectives for land use. So I always like to think of the official plan as kind of the blueprint for how we grow. It lays out the land uses, the policies around the land uses, and things and the criteria around sort of those specific designations. I'll talk about them in a little bit more detail, and then you kind of come to the pinnacle, which is the zoning bylaw, which is very, very specific. So we look at all these layers when we do things. And the example I like to give is the PPS and the growth plan. They talk about efficient use of land. They talk about intensification and redevelopment in a compact form. And those are kind of targeted in certain areas I'll talk about later. But these layers of policy are going wrong direction. These layers of policy kind of fit with other things that we look at, and this slide here kind of shows it. And along with the provincial policy statement, the growth plan, and the official plan, we do look at sort of the law behind things. We look at existing zoning bylaws. We look at other bylaws in the area. I mean, there's other bylaws that would apply, a ravine bylaw, heritage bylaws, council decisions, decisions by the LPAT. We look at sort of what's been done in a certain area. We also look at the details of the development and sort of where it's situated. You know, if they're proposing a building, how high is that building, and are there other buildings in that area that are similar to what's being proposed? And the people aspect of it, and that's what the applicant's proposing, the city agencies, the local councillor, and the community. And the one example I wanted to get to, and it's kind of a synthesis of all of this when we do our recommendations. And somebody once asked me, is one weighted more than the other? And I don't think it's like it's a weighting system. I'll give you an example. If 1,000 people came out to a meeting and said, along the Shepherd corridor, right next to Shepherd and Leslie is a good example. Shepherd and Leslie, we have a GO station, the Oriole GO. We have the Shepherd line, the subway stop there as well, and it's kind of a key node, right? So if someone came along and said all we wanted to see there was single detached 60-footers, it's contrary to the provincial policy statement, it's contrary to the growth plan, it's contrary to the official plan. So it's not always black and white. It's kind of a synthesis of all that comes at us, and the recommendations then are made to City Council. And all we do is we make the recommendations for City Council to ultimately make the decision.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So, when I look at this, I see in general how the city planning recommendations come about, but where do trends fit into it? We go through all of this examination. Is there any impact on the city planning recommendation that just comes from the development trend that just keeps coming at you? What are the trends in Don Valley North, and do they have any impact on your recommendations when you're looking at single applications using all of the measures we see in this slide?
So I think to understand, I mean, some of the development where it's happening, I don't think it's a surprise. I mean, this is where we go. This is where we look at sort of the official plan, and hopefully you can see the open structure map. So I have Ward 17 kind of highlighted there in black, but this is the urban structure. And in the city's official plan, there are certain areas where we direct growth. Those areas are obviously the downtown you see there in orange. Orange is a growth area. The red areas that you see there are centers. So you see Etobicoke Center, Young Eglinton Center, North York Center, and Scarborough Center. Those are growth areas. And the other growth areas are the employment areas, which you see in purple. Obviously, we want jobs. We want people to work and live in the city. And the other one is the avenues, in those sort of brown, linear areas that you see along major streets. Mm-hmm. What's applicable to Ward 17? You don't have any growth centers in there. You don't have a Young in Eglinton. You don't have a North York Center. But what you do have is you do have Shepherd Avenue as an avenue that is anticipated for growth. And you do also have the Consumers Business Park. And in the northeast corner, you have the sort of I know it as the Steels Tech.
Right.
So those are kind of the areas for growth where we kind of direct our growth to. And then with respect to the official plan, this is Ward 17. So you can see sort of highlighted with a black boundary, you have the Shepherd East subway corridor secondary plan, and Consumers Next is another secondary plan area. And secondary plan areas are just areas where we have additional policy direction in areas where we're experiencing growth. But when you look at this land use map, this is kind of the blueprint that I talked about earlier. So you'll see the yellow is our neighborhoods, and you see the green are our ravine areas and our natural areas, parks, open spaces. Those are the areas where we don't anticipate a lot of growth. And we always define our neighborhoods as stable, not static. So there will be growth, but not at the level that you'll see within an avenue, a mixed use area, or within the secondary plan areas. So So what you find is the neighborhood typically allows up to 4 stories, but there are policies that say you have to look at what the prevailing context is in the area. And a lot of the areas in Ward 17 are yellow. And not just in Ward 17, 3/4 of the city of Toronto falls within the ravine or the ravine area, the parks and open space areas or the neighborhoods areas. And a lot of the growth that you see is in the centers, the avenues, the downtown, um, and the employment areas. So this is kind of where we see um, the growth and the mixed use area. Just to go over some of the designations. I mean, neighborhoods is, like I said, is our neighborhoods. Apartment neighborhoods are exactly that. They're the areas where you see tall buildings, where you see mid-rise buildings, where you see some walk-up apartments, low-rise apartments. And the mixed-use areas are also areas where you will see growth. Mixed-use areas basically permit residential, commercial. They kind of permit a wide array of uses. And you see them along sort of the Shepherd corridor there as well, along the transit station areas. And obviously, again, we have our purple, which is our employment areas. So Ward 17 has 2 secondary plans, Shepherd Subway and Consumers Next, which is currently being dealt with by the LPAT as we talked about earlier.
Okay. And those red areas are the mixed use areas are the ones that if we're honest, they represent just the biggest change for people. Because if we went back to, prior to amalgamation and prior to the approval of the subway, those were all, save and except Fairview Mall, we were looking at, low-lying neighborhood zone or really narrow strips of mixed use areas, just narrowly along the business corridor of Shepherd. And now we see them all the way down to the 401 and all the way up north of the avenue. Those are really the biggest challenges for you, aren't they, in terms of when applications come forward there, you're dealing with the new, but you also have to deal with the updated policy. So those are a challenge, aren't they?
Yeah, I mean, they are. I mean, those are the areas where I think you see the most change. I mean, Bayview Village obviously is a mixed use area. The NY Towers are the mixed use area where you see some of the taller buildings. Concord 8X around the Canadian Tire lands there are all mixed use area, and that also goes with sort of what's around the Leslie station and around the GO station there. And again, that kind of corresponds to what the growth plan is saying, to intensify those areas along transit corridors, and we're seeing that. And obviously Fairview Mall is a large mixed use area. And Consumers Next, what recently happened was the edges of Shepherd and Victoria Park around Consumers Next went to a mixed use area as well. So those are the areas where you see the most change, Councillor. You will see change in neighborhoods, but it's not to the extent that you see within the mixed use areas, the avenues.
Right. Okay. And so if we can, having looked at that, we only have 2 secondary plans. There are a number of them around the city. How many there's the Toronto official plan, and then how many secondary plans? I think we have something like 30 of them.
I think so. There's 34 in the OP, but there's some that still haven't been incorporated. Consumers Next, because it's under appeal. Don Mills Crossing is another one that's close by at Don Mills.
Right.
So there's I would say 34, 35, 36 plus in that area right now.
Right. And so it really represents a large part of the growth across the city, because if you consider there are 25 wards and probably a lot of the secondary plans concentrated in the downtown where so much of the growth was concentrated. So there are multiple secondary plans there. It is pretty extraordinary to have a transit system suddenly make a suburban ward north of 401 having 2 secondary plans. This is a challenge, isn't it?
Yeah, I think it's where we expect it, and I think it's challenging because and some of the areas are changing, and it's not. I mean, it's not a Yonge and Eglinton where there's how do I describe Yonge and Eglinton? I mean, Yonge and Eglinton, there's multiple applications for towers on every corner. This is kind of that mix of
Yeah.
suburban and urban, where the Shepherd Corridor has the bulk of the height and the density, and it's the neighborhoods sort of in and behind that are protected um, within the yellow areas.
Okay. And so, should we look at the scariest map?
I don't.
Tell us about the actual application trends in Don Valley North today.
So the next slide I pulled is this is the our application information center website. So I alluded to earlier that all the information is posted online, and the web link is at the bottom of the page. But if you just Google City of Toronto AIC or Application Information Center, this is what comes up. And I searched under Ward 17, and the blue dots represent sort of the community planning applications, and those are the official plan amendments, the subdivision, the rezonings, the site plans. And those you can see, obviously, they kind of follow the mixed use areas that we talked about along the Shepherd Corridor. They're within around the Bayview Village area, NY Towers, Concord 8X, obviously in the Parkway Forest, the Parkway Forest area,
Right.
across from Fairview Mall, around Fairview Mall, and then the consumers next. It doesn't mean there aren't applications elsewhere, but in terms of trends and concentration, you see them along that Shepherd Corridor. And then the green dots are the Committee of Adjustment applications. Those are the more of the sort of the ones that are within the neighborhoods when someone's putting on an addition or building a new house. And those you can see in the green scattered throughout the neighborhood. And in terms of active applications, I think I took this screenshot 3 days ago or 4 days ago, and I was trying to get a cleaner one, and then we're at 63 applications. So I think those are the Committee of Adjustment applications that fall off because we just had a cycle.
Oh, okay.
If you were to go to this website as a resident and click on one of those dots, it tells you the status of the application, and it gives you all that information that was submitted, from arborist reports to servicing reports to transportation reports, all the plans and drawings. So that is available there. It gets you to a link to the website where any staff reports would eventually be there as well. So it's kind of if someone has a question about an application or wondering what was submitted, this is kind of the one-stop shop that'll get you all the information you want.
First place to start, right? And just to sometimes people, the Committee of Adjustment applications, we're always telling people as counselors that the Committee of Adjustment is that apolitical body. They get appointed, and they're not elected representatives. It's so that you can sort of take the politics out of things like single-family dwellings that just want to make a change. But they're on this map because your staff team still have to do a certain amount of rigor on those. They don't just go to that unelected body. They still go through that planning process that you described at the beginning of the presentation, just like a high-rise building would, don't they?
So every planning application would come to community planning. So what happens with the Committee of Adjustment applications is we kind of get the notice of what's intended on a particular site, and I'll have a staff member go through the notice and see what's being proposed, and we sit down and we discuss the applications. We discuss what's coming in. We talk about the floor test. Does it meet the general intent of the official plan? Does it meet the general intent of the zoning bylaw? Is it appropriate? Is it minor? So we discuss these things, and we look at other applications in the area and what's happened in terms of Committee of Adjustment applications. There are times, obviously, every applicant is different. There's sometimes we direct them to the local residents association. We direct them to the local counselor as well, if it's something that we feel might be a little bit more controversial. So those are reviewed as well. They don't just get sent to the Committee of Adjustment. They will all come sort of through the planning manager for the area.
Yeah. And well, as a politician, I'm not supposed to get directly involved in Committee of Adjustment. We do get the agenda. Ryan Lowe, many of you know, is my in-office planning specialist, looks at everyone. And if we see something that we know is just really not favored in the neighborhood. Maybe it's, it's on a hill on a street where there have been floods and the house is going to cover the whole lot, things like that. We can communicate to make sure that the panel knows this will be a concern, and we can correspond with the committee. But we're flagged that it's going through the committee, as are residents through the signage they have to put up, and then you have to reach out and get a little more information from planning and figure out how to get involved and raise your voice. So let's go there. How do residents really voice their opinion? There are different portals and different opportunities at which they can do that, aren't there?
So I'll kind of go back to this process slide, and there are the two key ones I mentioned, which would be the community meeting hosted by city planning. That's the first one.
Right,
And,
where the little people are. Yes. Okay. Yeah.
It's where the little people are. That's the first one. The community meeting hosted by city planning. And again, in the process, we haven't made any decision on that at that point. That's an opportunity to present it to the community and hear any other concerns. The other key piece is when we report, when we have a final report with recommendations to North York Community Council. However, I mean, throughout this process, there's not sort of a block on here where you can't communicate either through your office, people express their concern, with me as the manager, with the planner on the file, or with some of the departments that are reviewing some of this information. And so it's kind of from beginning to end. I mean, it's from when the application is first submitted. We get emails and letters all the time. I have conversations with residents on a regular basis about applications. Submitting it in writing is usually also good through email, and I always tell people submit it to the planner and the local council's office so they know sort of what the concerns are. And we try to address those concerns in the planning reports, but we try to address the planning related matters. I mean, a lot of times there's a lot of concerns that are raised that aren't planning related, that we only deal with the planning related matters. But as we go through, I always like to say that no one application is exactly the same. So depending on the size of the application, we've had our typical community meeting hosted by city planning, but we also have open houses, we have design charrettes, we have working groups, and so there's various ways to approach these, and sometimes on bigger applications, people have a lot of times you can't get the feedback you want in a meeting of 200 or 300 people. So what we'll do is we'll break it down and have smaller working group meetings on a specific topic. Some people may want to talk about transportation, so we'll have a transportation working group. Some people want to talk about parks and open space, so we'll have a working group on parks and open spaces. So it's not a kind of a one size fits all.
Mhm.
A lot of times we're in contact also with residents associations as well. And I mean, I think, when we know there's a bigger application, and some of the more sophisticated developers will obviously reach out to the residents associations as well ahead of time. Some developers also like to host pre-meetings on their own before they even come to city planning, because they want to introduce it to the community before the formal application comes in. So it's not a one size fits all. This flow chart kind of flags the two kind of key consultation events, but in terms of providing feedback, there's a number of opportunities throughout the process, all the way up to the point when the decision is made.
Right. So the key is whatever meeting you're at, know who you're giving your feedback to. We had one recently on an application, actually, early days yet. So the applicant, the developer applicant, hosted a meeting. That's fine. It gets the word out that this is coming, so I know that people start talking to me. But for the community, you really need to know who's hosting the meeting. If the applicant is hosting the meeting, when you're giving your feedback, you're really not talking to City of Toronto Planning then. That means that there will have to be a meeting later on where they're giving their feedback directly to your planners. Isn't that right?
Yes, I think that recently happened for one of the Concord ADEX
Yeah.
developer-led meeting.
Mm-hmm.
And again, developers do that. Sometimes they want to get out to the community early. Sometimes they just want to do their own consultation event. But that is a good example of one where we'll be coming out as city planning uh, on that application through this type of format. Obviously now during the COVID period, our consultation events are virtual and online. But that's one where we'd be coming back out to the community, led by city planning.
Okay, and last but not least,
Sorry.
oh, sorry.
Sorry, John, do you mind speaking up a little bit? It's sometimes a little hard to hear you.
Sorry.
That's okay.
Okay. Last but not least, at the end of this flowchart is there's a potential for an appeal at an LPAT. And one of the residents has already typed in the question, but I also had it on the list here from the Don Valley North team. I wonder if you could just talk briefly, and then we'll go to the open questions. Talk briefly about when residents get involved in LPAT, because it's changed recently. And knowing that the government put in place a support office, but then there was a change of government, they took away the support office. I think people are unclear about what it means. If they go to LPAT, they can go as an observer, but if they want to speak to that tribunal body, it's a little more involved, isn't it?
Yeah, so when community planning has our consultation events, we always do a sign-in sheet. And we always keep a sign-in sheet that if you want to be notified of subsequent meetings or your name provided to the local councillor, we ask people to sign in. So when you sign in, we enter your name on our system. So if an application were get appealed to LPAT, your mailing address is included in any notification you get from the LPAT. So that's why we tell people, if you want to be notified of subsequent meetings or anything sort of that happens after the community meeting, give us your name, give us your address, because that list goes to the LPAT and you'll get notification from the LPAT of any hearing. And you can attend the LPAT, and there's two ways. You could attend as a participant, as a resident, where you express your concerns about the proposal, or you could attend as a party. And there are implications if you attend as a party, because you can be put on sort of the stand. You can be cross-examined by the lawyers. There could be costs as well. So there's two different avenues to go. And I've seen residents do both. Participants, because they just want to express how the application impacts them, or they want to have more of an involved role and be a party. But that also then involves providing a witness statement, providing your evidence in advance and your visual evidence in advance. So the LPAT is we always call it a quasi-judicial court, where you provide opinion evidence, and there are lawyers there that ask you questions and cross-examine you. So if you are a party, that would happen. So there's two different routes you can take.
But you have to indicate which one you want to be at the beginning. You have to go to the earlier meeting.
Yes. So that's another piece to the LPAT, where if you haven't been involved, haven't been at meetings, haven't written in, haven't signed into anything, the LPAT could say to you no. If you decide just to show up at the LPAT having not been involved, the LPAT could say, you haven't been involved to this point, we're not going to include you as a party or as a participant. So that's why kind of if it's something that you want to be involved in, you should be involved in early, and that way you're on the list. You've written in, you've spoke at council, you've written to council, and that information is taken to the LPAT. So the LPAT knows that this individual was involved, was participating. It's not someone who wasn't involved in the process and has showed up at the end, because the LPAT could say thanks, but no thanks.
Okay. So those are the sort of big group questions that about the process itself that we wanted John to describe. But now I'm already starting to have questions come up on the board from people. Anyone who joined us after I described that at the beginning, if you look down to the bottom right hand corner where you see a little bubble that says participants, and then you'll see blue Q&A. If you type in your question there, our staff are typing them into my window so that I see the questions coming. And if it's one they've already got up on the board, they may tell you that it's already there, and we're going to try and get through them. So now they take on a little bit more of if you can comment on in the Don Valley North context. I see one here. Can you please detail the studies that were done? And this is in general for the whole sort of busy area. Can you please detail the studies that were done for the water, the electricity, and sewage, as well as internet, and especially the road traffic for the thousands of additional residents that have come to this area? So we're really talking about that Don Valley North Growth Corridor. Were there overarching studies?
So every applicant is required to submit servicing report, transportation report. So those reports, our engineers and our transportation engineers will look at, and they'll look at sort of the system, and you're adding 1,000 units. There's already an existing number of units. What does that mean for the system? So there are always, as part of a development, a larger development, a transportation study, a servicing study. We don't do studies on internet capacity. We do circulate to Rogers and to Bell, and they comment about, is there capacity in the area, or they have to install sort of cables in the area to upgrade the internet. We also circulate to Toronto Hydro. They're part of our circulation package. I should say, I also live in Ward 17. I kind of live in the NY Tower area, and I guess maybe it's one of my neighbors, because I notice we get a lot of power outages in the summertime when everybody's air conditioner is on. But all that information is submitted and circulated. So every one of those agencies, departments would comment and provide feedback to us. Sometimes the applicant, a good example is on servicing capacity. Sometimes developers have been told there's not capacity. You have to upgrade the sewers in the area so that you can build. Or we have an option to put a hold, which means you get your zoning, but we put a hold on it, which means you can't build till something has to happen. And it's usually a trigger like servicing or transportation.
Right. And so by and large, you're doing that, but you used a good example, the unplanned outages. When you circulate to Hydro, they make a plan to improve the service in that area, but it sometimes lags. They're in the area this summer, for instance, but there's been a lot of growth in the year or two before. They simply have to apply to their regulator to be able to go forward and increase that service. But they do the study, and the applicants do the studies.
The Hydro and school board are good examples where we provide them with the numbers that they need. We provide them with the population numbers in terms of the increases, and they plan for their schools. They plan for sort of what they need to improve their infrastructure in the area. But you're right, sometimes there is a bit of a lag.
Yeah. Usually somehow politically driven, but we're going to try to stay out of too much of the political statement. So I'll just ask another one that really is a follow-on to this. By the time the developer comes to the community, it seems like a lot of the work and the decisions that have been made along the way, formally or informally, have already been made. Is there a way for residents to be involved earlier rather than at the end?
So the earliest process, the earliest time is when the application is actually submitted. I mean, if a resident sees something on the AIC website and goes through the information and their concerns, they could flag it then. So as I kind of have walked through this process, I mean, everything is a little bit unique. Obviously, during COVID, we've had more time to work with some of the applicants because we couldn't get out and do a consultation. I know sometimes during election times, when there's a freeze, applications come in and we can't consult with the community. But typically we try to get out to the community as early as possible. I never like to go to a second circulation until I've actually had a chance to have the planner go out and consult with the community. Like I said, I mean, we know these communities, but we don't know them like the residents who live in the communities. And we do hear a lot of issues that revolve around traffic, that's kind of height, density, things that are typical, but there's always something that comes out that we maybe haven't considered, or there's a different angle on it. So we always try to come out as early as possible, but anytime an application is formally submitted, comments could come in from residents to the planner that's listed on the file. And if there's a concern, you could flag it upfront. A lot of times, you know, we've had residents submit letters to us and say, these are my concerns, send it to the developer. And we flag to the developer that there's a number of issues here. These are the concerns from the residents that you have to take into consideration during any resubmission, during any revision.
Right. So there's a follow-on to that. This next question is, it's in a way it's kind of local, but it speaks to that thing that happens because developers have the right to communicate whatever they want. And so there sometimes is confusion about whether you've done your planning exercises or not, whether council's done it. And this is a perfect demonstration of it. The question from Neil is, what's happening with Fairview Mall? Something was announced last year, but it's been silent ever since. Has this been approved? And I think that comes from, I don't know if you saw it, but if you're a resident, maybe you did, John. The North York Mirror had the splashiest article and the most finished looking vision of Fairview Mall turned into something entirely different. And that was fairly in advance of coming to talk to you as a planner, wasn't it?
Yeah, Fairview Mall is a good example. I mean, all the malls are kind of hotspots for redevelopment. Yorkdale's going through something. Obviously, Bayview Village was going through something, is going through something. All the malls are, whether it's a big mall or a little strip mall, all the malls are kind of these areas that I would say are probably mixed use designations throughout the entire city, and have some form of redevelopment. So Fairview Mall was one of those ones where we did have a pre-application meeting about it, and they bounced some ideas off of the city, and we said, you know, you've got to go back and do some more work. But they wanted to come out and do that initial kind of announcement to the community on their own. We don't have an application on Fairview Mall, and we haven't made any decision. And I think the reason we don't. So the pre-application meetings are not posted online. We don't do that just because some of them never materialize. I've had people come to me for racetracks in the middle of neighborhoods as a pre-application meeting. So some of them are fishing expeditions by developers to test the waters. Some of them are just not real. So we don't usually list the application. But the Fairview Mall is Cadillac Fairview, obviously. They wanted to do a press release on that, but to answer the question, no application's been submitted and no decision or any finality on any of that. That is a good example of one where I think, and I know the councillor would support it, is there'd be multiple meetings on that, likely working groups on parking spaces, transportation, height, density. So that if it comes in, when it comes in, will be a number of consultation events on that. I think it's fair to say.
Yes. Similar to Parkway Forest south of it, there'd have to be a long process. Rod asked a question here. When the comments from various city planning departments on a developer's proposal development, when are they available to the public? And I think that's a good question for Don Valley North right now, because they saw the map, you are busy. There have been a couple of really large ones that ate up a lot of your staff time. So there are some where a preliminary report, the first little bubble there, preliminary report to community council where it shows a little pencil on the flow chart, happens and the community knows something. But then sometimes there's a very long time to get to, here's what planners think about this application. Your final report can be a long time coming and they don't have anything public from you. So how do we deal with that? Can you still tell them over the phone how you're feeling about it, or you have to write that report?
So we typically don't take a position on something till we've written our final report. I mean, there's a number. I mean, the planner's got to look at it. It's got to go to the manager. It's got to go to the director. Then it ultimately goes to community council. So, and there's always revisions. I think
Right.
that's the thing you were getting at, Councillor. So sometimes there is a gap between when the application was first submitted, and sometimes if it's gone through a second or third or fourth circulation, if there's been substantial changes to an application, sometimes we'll go back out to the community and just say, hey, you came in with X. There's been 2 years or 3 years of technical review causing changes to the application. We're going to have to go out again. Or other
Mhm.
times, sometimes we're criticized by developers for saying we take too long on an application, but we'll give the developer comments sometimes and they go away and they don't come back and they're thinking about it and they're looking at the market and a COVID hits and they're waiting to see what happens, and then there's a long gap in between. So there are applications where we will go back out if it's been a long time, but that depends on the nature of the changes that are made to the application through that process. And the first part of that question is about the comments. So the comments we don't post online, but if you were to email the planner, they would provide the comments from the various departments. I think we're looking at, so, you know, COVID was kind of, the AIC website was up and running before COVID. I think
Yeah.
COVID is obviously making every industry look at how we do things, and we're looking at automating more of our processes and more of the information that's available. So that's one thing that's been asked, not just by this group, but by other groups throughout the city, about can we get access to those comments. You can.
Mhm.
They're not posted at this time. They're not available online, but the planner can provide those comments.
The most initial comments and the really important piece where you have at least weighed the developer's idea against those provincial policies and things. The really important read, and sometimes people skip over it, that preliminary report. It's a long way from decision time. That hasn't even had the big community meeting yet, but that's always a good read, isn't it? Because it will include initial comments, your initial weighing of it against policy, and even if the minute the notice went up on the lawn of the property, you're inundated with phone calls. Community comment can be in that first preliminary report, and that's an important one to read, because in that one you tell us, I've only had a few of them, but usually you tell us, according to these policies by the province in your own official plan, we do have to go through the process and consider this. On rare occasions, sometimes you say, it's so far away from those provincial policies, we think you should refuse to even consider this. So that first preliminary report, that can be a real good indicator of what's about to unfold, can't it?
Yes, sometimes we look at applications sometimes, and we used to kind of red light, green light, green light, yellow light. We used to look at them, and some when they come in, we're so far off that you're not going to bridge the gap. There's uh, there's ones that we would just refuse outright because there's no way that gap could be bridged, because it doesn't address something in terms of a key policy on the growth plan, the PPS, or even the official plan. A good example: if someone came in within a residential neighborhood, in the interior of a residential neighborhood, and bought up 50 lots and decided to put a tower in the middle of a neighborhood. I'm giving you an extreme here, obviously,
Yeah, yeah.
right? And then there's ones where we write the prelim report, and there are issues. We always flag issues, things that we really need to consider when we review the applications. And those are the ones where you think, okay, well, it's kind of a yellow light where it could get an approval or it could get a refusal in terms of a recommendation, depending on how it kind of plays out. But there's room. And then there's ones that come in sometimes that are really good. You still got to go through the process, and there may not be that many issues, but according to the Planning Act, according to the official plan, there's certain things we still have to do. We still have to have a community consultation meeting, regardless if it's a great application. You still have to have the meeting. You still have to do the circulation. You still have to write the report. You still got to go to North York Community Council. So it's still, you have to follow the process. But that report, Councillor, obviously it's a good indicator of what the issues are that we're going to be looking at up front.
Okay. Here's a good one. And this is someone I think has been, it must have been, he read an e-blast I did a month or so ago, or he's been reading about this in the paper. Baldwin asks, those green dots on the map of Don Valley North, the Committee of Adjustment, they look like they're probably all monster home applications. Is there any future for our yellow zone, meaning neighborhood zone, aside from just a gradual shift from smaller houses to larger houses?
So I find a lot of the applications we get into the in the interior of neighborhoods. Obviously, people are redeveloping their homes, additions, demos, and new homes. That kind of fits with the our neighborhoods being stable, not static. That they're going to change. There was a recent report. There's another committee, not just North York Community Council, but Planning and Housing Committee, um, and there was a report on what we call that yellow area, the yellow belt, the missing middle, and it's looking at ways to gently intensify those areas. So those areas allow for consideration of up to 4 stories. It allows singles, semis, towns, walk-ups, but there's a set of criteria that you still have to evaluate. Just because the official plan allows you to consider it, it doesn't mean you just get it as of right. That you still have to evaluate it based on the criteria. So there is a report and a study that's going to be going done citywide to look at those yellow areas, and are there areas where we want to do singles and semis, or semis and townhouses. And some of those areas might be the areas along the major streets, like the Leslies, like the York Mills, like the Lawrences, like the Birchmounts in Scarborough, where you're on a major street, and if you do have singles, where you may want to see towns or walk-ups. So that is going to be done citywide, that study, and it was on. I'd have to check on which planning and housing it was, but it was in the last few planning and housing committees.
Yeah, it was recently. I have one more question before we get to. I want to leave a fair amount of time because a lot of questions are about how planning and development of buildings intersects with transportation planning, vis-a-vis our growth. But there's a question that sort of is a concern in our neighborhood because we have 2 business parks. One of them we really worry about because it has its mixed use edge, and you had a rolling consumers next. Susan asks, can you speak to us about any recent provincial policy changes that could make it easier for a developer to change employment zoning and have the mixed residential move into the employment part of that zone? Are our purple zones safe?
That is a question that's going to take a long time to answer, but
you asked the $64,000 question tonight, Susan.
Yeah, Susan, good question. We try obviously to protect our employment lands because once they're gone, they're gone. So we don't typically rezone and convert and do official plan amendments in the employment areas. We try to keep them as employment, but every 5 years we have to review our official plan. And there's a lot of pressure on those employment lands to convert, to go to residential, to go to mixed use, to go to apartment neighborhoods. And that's exactly what happened with Consumers Next around the edges, that during the last municipal comprehensive review, there was a review done and those areas got changed from the purple to the red. August 4th, I think August 4th, 2020, the city started its second, sorry, not its second, but another municipal comprehensive review as we're required. We're required to update the official plan and be sort of in conformity with the growth plan and consistent with the PPS. So the city's going through that review now. There's a set of criteria we look at that if we're going to convert, if there's a need to convert it, they look at, but they don't look at it just on, they won't look at just Consumers Next. They're going to look at this on a citywide basis. It's our policy team, and they're looking at all those employment areas if there's a need for the conversion. And as part of the sort of the review that we're doing now, we're also looking at all the transit stops, all the transit station areas. So the growth plan indicates that we have to have minimum densities around those major transit station areas. So we have to designate those areas. And that's also a review that's being done by our policy group. And I think at last count, we had something like 180 major transit station areas that our policy team will have to look at. So there's a lot of work ahead of our policy staff to look at those things.
Yeah, yeah. So now, I wonder if we could turn to. There are a number of questions, and if I sort of put them all together, it's about how does development intersect with that godforsaken thing, the traffic study. It's very frustrating for people when they hear that it's the developer who submits the traffic study to you, and so they worry about the application by application transportation impacts, but they also wonder about how planning intersects or interacts with transportation planning, because there's congestion guys who go out and help in the immediate and realign lights, but we also have traffic planners trying to plan how we're going to deal in a growth area like this. And I think the reason I'm seeing a lot of those questions is while we're dealing with that case by case, we've really we have hit a critical mass at the moment between Don Mills and Consumers Road, the Fairview Mall 404 sort of point there. We're at a point there where it needs attention, certainly before we see that Fairview Mall thing we saw in the newspaper. So how does planning and development, who are focused on built form and density and such, make sure that transportation is keeping pace with us? Or can you?
So it's a good question. I think just to be clear, when the applicant submits a transportation study, we don't just accept it. Our transportation planners and our transportation engineers review that information, and they've got to agree with it. It's just not a blanket. We accept it, and I think there's a general trend that we're not just looking to move cars anymore. We're looking at different modes of transit. We're looking at moving people, and we're looking at all our developments, and it's obviously it's no doubt. Along Shepherd is a desirable sort of location to live, and that's why you see sort of the towers that are going there, because people want to be close to transit. They want to have access to their car, to the transit, to cycling, to different types of facilities. So we're always trying to look at ways to move people, not just cars. So when we look at our developments right now, we try to push parking rates as low as possible in areas, so we can get other modes of transportation in. I mean, some developers now, they're required to provide transit passes to people moving into their condo. We're putting in more cycling facilities within the neighborhoods to try to get people out of cars and onto bikes. And I had this interesting conversation with a fella from Leaside when I was in the neighborhood, and he said to me, he was 90, and he said to me, "You expect me to cycle?" And I said, "Well, no, but I mean, you need the choice and the option out there, not just with vehicles." I mean, like I said, I moved into NY Towers because it was close to the 401. So I have access throughout the city. It was close to public transit, but there's also a lot of amenities in and around that area that you can walk to. I mean, I think I'm one of the guilty ones that drives, but a lot of times I also walk to the mall and do my shopping. I walk and go get a coffee. So there is this, I know there's this frustration with transit also, but we're always trying to reduce the parking rates. We're trying to introduce more modes of travel. So it's not always the vehicle. And, somebody once said it to me that we have 80,000 people coming into sort of the greater Toronto area. And if you gave every one of those people a car, you'd never be able to manage. We're not building more roads. And it's a way of, we have to look at different modal choices in how we do things. So it's not, maybe you don't drive every time and go to the grocery store, but you drive one time, you cycle one time, you walk one time. And I think it's a generational mode thing that people these days, there's a lot of sort of, and I put myself now in a bit of that older generation where I always drove. And a lot of people coming up these days have said to me, "I don't own a car." There's another sort of group that says you shouldn't be allowing any parking in buildings. You should only be doing cycling. You should only be doing transit. So it's kind of a long-winded answer, Councillor, but We do look
Yeah.
at reducing the parking rates on these developments. We look at introducing, car share parking spaces. A lot of the buildings, we allow them to reduce the parking in the building if they provide car share units within the building, bike share units within the building, and those networks are always expanding.
Okay. And I can tell you that it's one of the reasons I like to be on the commission is to try and get easy access to the information where they're counting how often that results in ridership, and the Shepherd subway is not doing badly. Okay, so I have 3 or 4 questions that staff have sent me here, and I'm going to try and burn through them because we've got about 10-15 minutes left. So let's see if we can do that. And this one really, this is full circle from when you tell us what policies you've weighed something against at the beginning of the process. Ash has a question about the end of the process. To what extent are your planner recommendations affected by the city's ability to fight? Ash actually put quotation marks. He's right. How often are your recommendations affected by the city's ability to fight a developer if the application does end up at LPAT? Do you have to take that into account, what your chances are at LPAT?
I never like to completely look at LPAT and see and base my decision on what the LPAT did, because sometimes I don't agree with some of the decisions that come out of the LPAT. And a good example would be Bayview Avenue, out of Ward 17, but Bayview Avenue, sort of before I got up to North York, there was Bayview Avenue has a lot of singles fronting on Bayview, large singles.
Oh, right, further south, yes.
South of York Mills. So our policies, I mean, you had quite a consistent street with single detached, large lots, and that was the character of the neighborhood. Developers started to apply for townhouses, and the city fought them. It went to the OMB at the time. The city lost. Next one came along. City refused it again. Went to the OMB and lost. And this happened for a number of times. And at some point, the OMB, or sorry, I keep referring to it as OMB. Sometimes it changes the area. So at that point, the city looked at that and said, well, we probably, if it's going to townhouses along Bayview, let's establish a set of guidelines that are going to help us review these applications and help us guide what's going to happen here. So there was a bit of a change at that point along Bayview. But I never look at an application and solely look at what's happened at the LPAT, but we do look at it. But I mean, it's not I don't kind of weigh.
Oh, is John frozen for everybody? Did John?
I think he's
Is he back?
out.
There we are.
Yeah, I just said we had a bit of a power outage here at North York.
I'm going to call Hydro as soon as I hang up. So rather than say, oh, we have to cave on all of these individual applications now because LPAT won one, you do go back and look at a decision and say, okay, let's set a defensible set of guidelines here and stand with that at LPAT.
We do look at what the LPAT decisions are and why they made those decisions. And like I said, we don't always agree with the LPAT decision. So I don't sit there and think, okay, we're going to lose this at the LPAT. If it's good planning, it's good planning, and we base our recommendations on what we think is good planning. It doesn't meet sort of the policies that we look at, that we kind of synthesize. Doesn't meet sort of the law, the people, the policies, and the statistics, right? That we look at and when we synthesize. But to say we don't read the decisions and look at what the reasons were for an approval or refusal, I mean, we do.
Well, I think what the questioner is asking though is, do you, when the next application comes in, sort of think, oh, we won't win, so let's approve this. You still take the hearing and you take good planning there, is what I hear you saying.
What one decision wouldn't sway, I don't think. If there's a number of decisions, that's when we may have to look at it and say, is something happening in this area that's different? Do we need to do a study, right? So that might be the next step where, and that's kind of what happened with Bayview with the guidelines. We did a study and we did guidelines to look at, okay, if we're getting these townhouses here, how do we want these townhouses, and why is the board making this
Yeah.
decision? So we would study an area. We wouldn't just say, okay, we're going to listen to the board and do exactly what the board said because it's one application. I don't think
Right.
one application sets the context for an area.
Okay.
And the press- and the
Um,
press moving forward.
Now, this is a job, and I can't believe we didn't get to this before now. Paula asks, can you explain the process where the developer gives the community money, like what happened in the Pleasant View area? And just to bring you up to speed there, Pleasant View is one of the earliest places where we used a participatory budgeting process to decide what to do with $500,000 from the Tridel development there on Shepherd, and that was an interesting way of doing it. I realized how very arbitrary Section 37 was at that time because a lot of people came in the door and they didn't realize money like that does flow to the community until we made it democratic. So if you could explain sort of how it was, but I think you should probably also break the news that that is changing.
So
You tell them the bad news.
you leave the bad news to me. Thank you. So there are a number of areas, and a good example might be for those of you that know the northwest corner of Don Mills and Shepherd. We did there's an applicant came in and wanted to do infill development, and there's larger old kind of tower in the park sites, and there's room on those sites for additional infill, additional towers. So as part of those proposals, I mean, it's a Section 37 contribution. What we refer to it as is if there's an increase in height and density, then there's a financial contribution or an in-kind contribution. We could say to the developer, the zoning bylaw only allows 1,000 square meters and 100 units. You're proposing 500 units and 10,000 square meters of density or more. There should be some kind of facility on site or cash contribution to build for some kind of public benefit. So we, at times like that, will put it. I mean, it's an open and a public process in that it's right in the bylaw. It says the amount of money and what it's for. So in the Don Mills area that I'm referring to, there's money for Oriole Community Center. There's affordable housing component. There's other cases where we've asked for. I mean, Parkway Forest, that's part of how the community center was built because there were so many residents coming in, there were so many units that it was a situation where, okay, but if you want these units and you want this development, then there's got to be some kind of benefit to the public. And it was the parks, the community center. I think, Councillor, correct me if I'm wrong, there was daycare there as well.
Yep, it was the largest Section 37 ever negotiated at the time. But they were making an extraordinary change, and so it was warranted. Yeah.
The Concord 8X around the Canadian Tire Lands, that community center, I think it was $8 million for the community center. There was $9 million for public art. So there was things that the developer has to contribute to make it a complete community, to make it a livable community. It's not just insert the units and the density, but what else makes this, what other public benefit could be provided here at the developer's cost to make this community a complete community? And those are good examples because the community center at the Bessarion there has a community center, it has a library, it has a daycare,
Childcare, yeah,
healthcare. And that has a really spectacular park in the middle with a lot of public art in that area. So it's a contribution to as a community benefit, but it's spelled out in the bylaw as to what is being given and what it's to be used for.
Mm-hmm.
And the bad part about all this is through sort of some of the recent changes, the province has done away with Section 37. There's a new charge, and I think we still haven't figured out exactly how that new community benefits charge will work, but there'll be still some kind of charge, but we're still trying to figure out the specifics about it because there was an announcement made this week, and I'm not up to speed what the most recent changes to that were.
Right. We know that we know that the quantum goes down, that what flows to the community will be less because those basic development charges that used to go to just underground infrastructure, water, that sort of thing that had to go with every unit on a per unit basis are now going to be combined somehow with those community benefit dollars. But it begs the question, can we keep working with the provincial policymakers to find creative ways? And here in Don Valley North, we have two perfect examples. In Parkway Forest, the community benefit negotiations led to a community center is needed, but the number of dollars is lower than it takes to build a community center that the developer is required to contribute. And the concept developed, what if the developer builds the community center? Parks and Rec will give him the specs and he will build it. And of course, you know, because they're building in the private sector, they used our long-wearing, you know, hard-wearing community center specifications, but he was able to build it for much less using the architect that was working on his development and the construction crew that was working on his development. He was able to do it for much less. Bessarion, the city took cash, but we've had to add our own cash to that to get that community center done, and it took many more years. So those two examples tell us, yes, the province may be reducing how they calculate this community benefit charge, but will they, through their regulations, permit the kinds of creative negotiations that can make sure that we still get to put the community infrastructure that is needed to help ameliorate the impact of growth on the community. So stay tuned, because when we do have those finalized regulations, I'll be writing about it in an e-blast, and we'll commiserate together, but we'll also figure out the future together, and we can all go hand in hand to talk to our provincial partners about how to perfect it. The next question I want you to answer, even though it's a question about councillors, I'll put you on the spot, John, and then I'll maybe follow up. What power do councillors have in the development process? Can a councillor stop a development from happening?
So
it's a good question.
yeah, no, it is a good question. I mean, we obviously work closely with the councillors in the wards that we work in, and we have a flavor sort of for the area. But at the end of the day, I mean, the planners still have to look at what the policies say and sort of those things that we take in consideration, and we have to make a recommendation. But that recommendation goes to the council, to not just Councillor Carroll, but would go to all of North York Community Council, and we don't always agree. And there's a lot of times where we put forward reports where planning staff recommended support of an application, and the council has refused it, and vice versa. So we're always in contact. We're always updating each other. We're always talking about applications that are coming in. The councillors, I know, are voicing sort of what some of their concerns are, things that they want us to look at a bit more closely and review. So it's a partnership. It truly is a partnership with the local councillor. But at the end of the day, the recommendation goes forward, and after that, it's the community council that makes that decision, and ultimately the city councillor. And Councillor Carroll and I speak regularly. We have meetings. We go over applications, and she flags to me things that are a concern to her that she wants me to look at. Things that she points out, certain communities that she knows that things that are going to be an issue. So it is a partnership, and we're always in contact. But you know, I'm trying to think, Councillor, have we had any where we've disagreed yet?
Not really. I will say this, in the time that John has been in the North York office, he's been there during this change from one planning bill at the provincial level to another, and then another. And so we've been sort of having to figure out what the regulations are. But the long and short of it, though, for the person who asked the question, Ida, is that I'm stuck in the same box that planning is stuck in. The city as a whole, whether we're talking about city staff, the city planner, or the elected official, the councillor, we're the ideal place for development to be considered, but the developer always has the ability to go and appeal to the province. And so I have to be mindful of that too. And so I really do have to consider that really the best way forward for me is to form that partnership, tell me like it is type of relationship with the planners, and really work to make sure that the city planners are headed to the LPAT on your behalf and mine with good planning to fight a case and say, here is good planning. If they're not, the developer's not willing to do it this way, then we don't stand by it. That sort of thing. It's better if he and I are on the same page there, because ultimately that developer always has the ability to appeal over both my head and the planners. And so we work together to make sure that we're doing what's best for you. I will say we've had a couple of applications recently where we got to the very end of a very long process because they were large sites, and the planners can get towards the end, they get down to the really nitty gritty of this sewer line and that easement and trying to write this giant report. And the planner has to, or the counselor, I should say, and Ryan at my side, we have to read really carefully that report and listen very carefully when they're briefing us about the final details, because ever so infrequently, but every once in a while, they might forget a deal breaker for you that you mentioned at the very first meeting, and it was 2 years ago. And then they went away to do the work that planners do. It's my job to remember what you said at that meeting 2 years ago and make sure that these guys remember it when they're writing the final report. And that came up recently where a really important thing at the end, it seemed minor because so much process had gone on, and I had to say, well, that's a deal breaker. We forgot about that. And guess what? That's not going to fly. And they resolved it. They did resolve it. And so we go to the LPAT. I can honestly say, to the best of our ability, reflecting what you said at the beginning of the process, but also what the planners know professionally is their best pass at this would be good planning if they did it this way. So that's sort of, in a nutshell, how we end up working together.
If I could just add something, Councillor Gross. Sorry.
Yes.
An old manager once had told me that, at the end of the day, as a planner, you have to be comfortable in the recommendations you're making and in the review you did, because you have to defend them on your own. You're at community council, you could get questioned on it. Why did you recommend what you recommended? Or if it goes to the LPAT, you're on the stand giving your evidence. You have to defend why you did what you did. So it's about putting forward your best recommendations based on the information you have.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And I have to rely on the planner because one thing we hear from the city solicitor again and again, a wise city solicitor sat me down once when I was young and passionate in my very first big project, which was the ARIA at 25 Buchan Court. Some of you will know it. And it went to the OMB, and I said, well, what day is that? I'll want to speak, of course. And the lawyer said, no, you won't. And I was pretty feisty about it. I actually went to the chief city solicitor and said, that lawyer that you put on this OMB appeal says I can't speak at the hearing. And she said, Councillor, you don't want to speak at this hearing. She said, there's nothing more uncomfortable than watching a councillor try and take the stand at one of these, because every developer has the best lawyer in town, and they simply put you on the stand and then grill you on everything you ever voted on anywhere else in the city. And try they pretty quickly demonstrate to the adjudicator in that hearing, set this politician aside. Let's get back to the legal arguments here. And so when you go there, that's why we all really have to. John and his team, he'll have a local planner who's assigned to the application, and he's right by their side. John and his team. We really, if we're in a contentious one, and we probably are going to end up in an appeal, we really have to be able to rely on his planners and the lawyer that they get assigned to make our case for us, and then use the community members who feel they're up to being either a participant or a party. So it's best if we really try to work together as we're going through the process to make sure that we're really getting the best according to our policies, regard for the provincial policies, but we want good planning in our neighborhood. And particularly when we're a growth neighborhood like this, we're only going to get there in partnership. We're just about at wrap up time, John. So I'll be making some closing remarks. But I'll just, the last question, I'm going to say to Francesco that we did an e-blast recently about gentle density, which is the idea of that change to the yellow zones that John talked about a little bit earlier. We're going to forward that to you, but it's also coming back. Our chief planner for the whole city, Greg Lintern, is going to be bringing a fairly major report back on that. Council sent him away to work on it. He'll be coming back with that later in the year. And so we're really going to have to look at that because it could have an impact on neighborhoods out here that we haven't really thought about yet. So I probably will be having a detailed meeting on that, hopefully after COVID times, but who knows? It may be in a virtual format like this. So John, before we go, first of all, I want to thank you so much for spending so much time. This is a lot to ask of our senior planner for North York, but you've given us a lot of your time, and I think enough of an overview that we can continue the conversation, and we can now relate all the things that you said to us back to individual questions that we expect to get from all of our callers. For our callers, you've probably already been told by some of the operators or online. On your individual applications, I know you probably have 10 more questions now as a result of hearing more about the process. We want you to email us. We want you to call us. But most of all, in terms of keeping track of development, you'll probably see up at the top there the name Ryan Lowe. And if you're an e-blast reader, you know that when big things happen, big changes in applications that the community are watching, below my little newsletter every Thursday night, every once in a while we have a report called the Lowdown. This Lowdown is in Ryan Lowe, and that's Ryan giving us an idea of a decision's about to be made or an LPAT hearing brought back a decision. The real important heart of the matter stuff shows up there. And so you want to hit the website and join up to receive our Thursday night e-blast. Promise, promise, promise. We only ever send it once a week. It won't be a nuisance. But also on this page, you'll see that our website has a development update page that sits there. We use the same map that John showed you tonight to show you what's going on. And it's that same interactive. You can click on the dots. And then if you have any questions, you can call us. Remember that John's team, they do a brave thing. Whenever that sign goes up and says a development application will come here, and there's a big, scary, yellow-sized high-rise tower on that signboard showing you what's been applied for, you also have the phone number of the actual development on that file. And you can phone that planner. You're phoning a city planner there and saying, tell me about this application. Where can I get more? What's the link to get me there? Their name sits there for as long as that signboard is up there for you to look at. So you see Ryan's number on the screen right now. You see development updates on the website. John told us early about on the toronto.ca website, the development page has the AIC/AIC to go and look at ward by ward application activity. So you have a lot more tools now to figure out what's going on with growth. And we can continue to have conversations now on applications where we can talk about where we are in that chart that John showed us from here on in. Thank you so much for helping us with that, John. We have town halls coming up, perfectly timed, and we hadn't planned on that. We were hoping it was going to be much further along in the recovery and rebuild next week, but COVID-19 is the topic next week. Recovery and rebuild is something we're still working on, even though the incidence is going up. we still have to get to work on how we're going to recover the economy and rebuild in a new and different way afterwards. And so we'll talk a little bit about recovery and rebuild, but we're also going to have to try and have someone on the line with us next week, October, or a couple of weeks. On October 8th, we're going to have someone with us to talk about where we're at with the numbers with COVID and how we're doing in terms of getting the numbers to go back down. In the meantime, you got to remember what the medical officer of health said. If you're going out the door of your house, you're going with your mask, you're not going to touch your face, you're going to wash your hands, and you're going to ask yourself this question: am I going somewhere because I have to, or is it because I want to? And while the numbers are high, because I want to might not be the right answer. So stay safe, be well, but we'll be here virtually next week so we can have a chat and we won't get lonely. Thank you all for attending tonight. Bye-bye.